Hello, I'm Maciej Bikos and you're watching World News Tonight. G7 countries will keep Russia's assets frozen until the war in Ukraine comes to an end. The group is also considering imposing new sanctions on the Kremlin. More on that in just a moment, but first, let's watch tonight's headlines. Donald Trump threatens Europe with a 50% trade tariff. Trzaskowski and Nawrocki poll neck and neck ahead of a presidential debate. And Polish Harvard students are anxious about their future. G7 finance ministers have pledged to keep Russian assets frozen until the end of the war. The statement supporting Ukraine has come as an unexpected show of unity as the United States avoids putting more pressure on the Kremlin. Moreover, the seven nations have threatened Moscow with new sanctions if it fails to reach a ceasefire in Ukraine. Kazimierz Wysiak reports.
All right, let's go to work.
In Canada, unexpected unity emerges from the meeting of G7 finance ministers.
We condemn Russia's continued brutal war against Ukraine. We reaffirm that Russia's sovereign assets in our jurisdictions will remain immobilized until Russia ends its aggression and pays for the damage it has caused to Ukraine.
Doubts before the summit from the seven most influential economies in the world concerned mostly the group's largest member, the United States. With the Donald Trump administration hesitant to put significant pressure on Moscow, the continued freezing of Russian assets was not a certainty.
If you look at the communique, a lot of people were wondering even at the time whether there would be a communique. And now what you have is that the best proof of unity is that we have a joint communique.
Kyiv's Western allies have frozen at least $300 billion of Russia's assets since the start of the invasion in 2022. According to experts, that's a severe blow to the Russian war machine.
Anything that the Russian central bank owns, essentially, in assets in the West. Now, that can be property, it can be yachts, ships, whatever the central bank happens to own, but this is primarily just simply cash that's held mostly in dollars, euros, pounds, held in Russian banks, in Western banks, which means Russia does not have access to them, they can't touch them, they can't move them anywhere.
Poland and several other European states have long advocated to not only freeze, but also use the Russian assets to help Ukraine in its defense against the invaders and for the future reconstruction of the country.
Third, we need to relearn how to champion the escalation game. For example, we could be seizing all 300 billion euros of Russian sovereign assets. Putin has already written them off.
Any kind of finance instrument, any kind of budget that actually reaches Ukraine has a lot more buying power than anything in EU. All of that speeds up not only the Ukrainian capability to defend themselves, but it actually gives us the technology that we need in the future much more faster.
But freezing economic assets and using them are two different things, presenting their own sets of challenges.
The key points that make that challenging are, one, international law. That is that most countries are concerned about seizing the assets of another country because there is the principle in bilateral investment treaties and other treaties of sovereign immunity. The Americans and the Europeans are both concerned that if they seize Russian assets, that will undermine confidence in both the dollar and the euro.
Despite the agreement to continue freezing Russian assets, the statement from the G7 summit has a softer tone than in previous years. For example, there's been no mention of the illegal and unprovoked nature of Russia's invasion. Despite US President Donald Trump growing wary of Russia's peace-delaying tactics, he still hasn't committed to putting substantial pressure on Moscow. For TVP World, I'm Kazimierz Wysiak.
US President Donald Trump has announced his intention to slap 50% tariffs on imported European goods. If followed through, the measure would kick in at the beginning of June. The threat comes hard on the heels of trade negotiations between Washington and Brussels, which Trump believes are going nowhere. And so we are joined now by our EU correspondent Angela Skujins in Brussels. Good evening, Angela. So how has Europe reacted to this bombshell news?
Yes, so we've heard some full-throated reactions from various European leaders. This includes the Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof calling on a robust response from the European Commission, which is handling these trade negotiations on behalf of the 27 EU member states. We've also heard from the German Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul saying that this threat undermines those talks between Brussels and Washington. We were hoping for something a little bit more official coming out of the Belgian capital. We know that the EU's top trade negotiator, Maros Šefčovič, the EU's trade commissioner, has been engaged in a phone call with his US counterpart, Jamieson Greer, from at least 5:30 p.m. Warsaw time. We've been hounding the Commission spokesperson service for an update or for an official response regarding this threat from that 47th President of the United States, but nothing has materialised just yet. We have heard commentary from Poland's trade minister himself, as well as the EU Commissioner for Defence. They were both speaking at a press conference centred on competitiveness. Let's take a listen to what that Polish trade minister had to say regarding his confidence in Maros Šefčovič and the way that he has handled these talks, as well as how the Defence Commissioner Andrius Kubilius sees this latest threat from that 47th President of the United States. Let's take a listen.
Despite pretty dynamic, some would even describe it a bit of a roller coaster conversations with the U.S. side of the previous weeks, we stay united, and that's the message, and that's the backing that the Council gives to our main negotiator, who happens to be Commissioner Šefčovič.
Thailand won one lesson since especially recent period of time, that old, not so old now, but British traditional, saying keep calm and carry on. It's really a very practical suggestion to all of us.
Yes, at the top of that was Poland's Trade Minister Michał Borowski, and then followed up with that EU Commissioner for Defence, Andrius Kubilius. But what happens next in the timeline? So there are only 8 days between now and June the 1st, when that 50% tariff would kick in, affecting that €1 trillion trade relationship between the EU and the US. It comes as a halfway point between that 90-day pause between those tariffs spearheaded by US President Donald Trump last month, and those reciprocal tariffs posed by the European Commission in response. But we are hoping that there is some kind of reprise here and that a deal can be made that both sides are happy with. That. But that's all from Brussels. I'll send it back to you in Warsaw.
That was Angela Skujins reporting from Brussels. Thank you very much, Angela. As the clock counts down to Poland's presidential runoff on the 1st of June, the remaining two candidates are making their final pitches to voters. Tonight, the pair battles it out on live TV. As a new poll shows, they sit neck and neck ahead of next weekend's vote. Chief political correspondent Aaron Damon reports.
And then there were two. It is here in this studio tonight where centrist Warsaw Mayor Rafał Trzaskowski is facing off with the right-wing historian Karol Nawrocki in their first head-to-head televised debate of the campaign. It's the government-backed candidate against the man from the opposition Law and Justice Party. And despite Trzaskowski leading every major poll of the last few months, well, the final run-in is set to be razor tight. Let's look at this poll out today on your screens. It shows Trzaskowski and Nawrocki in effectively a dead heat tie. And on top of that, 6% of voters polled still don't know who they are going to vote for. The name of the game now is to pick up as many votes from the candidates who failed to make the first round, including the likes of the far right, Sławomir Mencen, who finished in third place with 15.4%. But remember, this election is not just about the domestic battleground. It's about Poland's role in Europe. It's about the relationship between Warsaw and Brussels, and it's about the ruling coalition's ability to pass its proposed reforms, which have been stalled by current President Andrzej Duda, who's a Law and Justice ally. That pattern of stalling, of vetoing, is likely to continue under Karol Nawrocki, but will change with Rafał Trzaskowski. So strap yourselves in. There's just over a week to go. In Warsaw for TVP World, I'm Aaron Darman.
9 countries, Poland among them, want the EU to change the foreign criminals expulsion procedures. The countries believe that the European Court of Human Rights protects the wrong people from deportation. Natalia Oriol reports.
Illegal migration has been the thorn in the side of many European countries in recent years. A report by the EU border agency Frontex said in January that while the numbers of migrants entering by irregular routes dropped by 38% overall in 2024, they spiked at EU borders with Belarus and Russia. Curbing irregular migration has become one of the key issues in European politics. On Thursday, leaders of 9 European countries, including Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk and led by Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and her Danish counterpart Mette Frederiksen, signed a letter questioning the European Court of Human Rights on its use of international conventions to halt deportations of felons among the migrants. The main proposals include more room to decide on expelling foreign nationals with criminal records, such as those involved in violent crimes, and tracking the ones who cannot be deported. The signatories have also requested the ability to take countersteps against hostile states who, quote, instrumentalize migrants at the borders. The goal is to tighten the conventions, to update and align them with today's challenges and avoid the chaos seen in recent years. Meloni said after a meeting with Frederiksen in Rome on Thursday.
Those cases in which, through the application of the European Convention on Human Rights, nations have been prevented from acting in defense of their citizens' security, able to order the expulsion of immigrant citizens who have committed serious crime. This initiative is, as I mentioned, open to contributions and endorsements from everyone. It marks the beginning of a debate. We want to start a serious debate indeed, a courageous one, because if there is one thing our generation has taught us, it's that we need to be able to think in new ways, without fear of tackling problems where we see them.
The ball is now in the European Court of Human Rights.
I have no interest in being re-elected or running for office again, says Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who has been ruling the country for the last 22 years. The statement comes as the presidential party attempts to change the country's constitution, which the opposition believes would allow Erdogan to serve even more terms. Aisha Bachi has this report.
Asserting that he has no intention for running for a 4th term after his current one ends in 2028, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said there is no underlying motive for the legislative change.
We want the new constitution not for ourselves, but for our country.
The key here is, I think, the way that he said it vaguely, which allows him to turn around and say, well, people are insisting that I run. Or it also allows people in his governing coalition to turn around and say, oh, Mr. President, please don't say that, we want you to run again.
For that to materialize, however, the president would need to call early elections, something the opposition has been openly demanding, but Erdogan has firmly ruled it out. Or to change the constitution. The credibility of the president's claims is under heightened scrutiny, especially following the arrest of Istanbul's former mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu, considered Erdogan's main rival. Meanwhile, the main opposition party, CHP, has seen its Istanbul offices repeatedly raided and several of its officials jailed, leading to the country's biggest mass protests in more than a decade. But on what grounds does the president propose to change the constitution, and what will the change actually be?
A potential constitutional change is critical for the peace process with the Kurds, who want to see a broader definition of who lives in Turkey. They don't want it defined by ethnicity, which is how it is in the current Turkish constitution. But this change is also necessary for President Erdogan to extend his term and the presidency. Right now, he has the problem of term limits.
President Erdogan remains an important figure within NATO, notably through Turkey's facilitation of recent Russia-Ukraine peace talks in Istanbul. Concurrently, the Turkish government achieved a historic milestone with the PKK's announcement to disband, effectively ending a 4-decade-long conflict.
Today, we have crossed another critical threshold in our process toward a tariff-free Turkey. The terrorist organization has announced its decision to dissolve itself and surrender its weapons.
But it remains to be seen whether Turkey's 22-year leader can convince parliament to change the constitution and give him the opportunity to govern further 5 years if he were to change his mind about his candidacy. Reporting for TVP World, I'm Aisha Badja.
Harvard, one of the most prestigious universities in the United States, is suing Donald Trump's administration over a decision to block foreigners from studying there. That opens another chapter in the struggle between the Ivy League university and the Trump administration, which is aiming to control the school. Notably, 1 in 4 Harvard students come from abroad. Sonia Gatabishchan has this report.
Harvard versus Donald Trump. On Friday, the Ivy League universities sued the U.S. administration over its ban on enrolling foreign students. At present, international students constitute over 27% of the university's enrollments this year, including Polish students who are being impacted.
In my case, I have only 1 year left to graduate and I cannot continue pursuing my degree. And for now, we don't know what will happen in the future. Harvard is still thinking whether they should pursue with online classes or find any other solution for the situation.
A day earlier, U.S. Homeland Security revoked the university's student and exchange visitor program, effectively blocking current and prospective foreign students from pursuing their Harvard education. Pursuant to the development,
the smartest guys and girls from around the world who are trying to find cures for cancer, for other important developments, their work will be stopped or their work will not begin at all.
And the reason?
This administration is holding Harvard accountable for fostering violence, anti-Semitism, and coordinating with the Chinese Communist Party on its campus.
It did not take long for the Chinese Foreign Ministry to react.
This approach from the United States will only damage the image and international credibility of the United States.
Very upset with Harvard.
Tensions between POTUS and Harvard escalated in March, when Trump looked to impose regulations on universities that hosted pro-Palestinian protests. He called them illegal, although protest leaders described their demonstrations as peaceful.
I think that this is just a way to show a warning to other universities in the US that they have to comply with the US government policies in terms of the ideological perspectives. Otherwise, they will get punished.
By cutting federal funding and grants during the feud, penalties imposed on the Ivy League university by the Trump administration now surpass $2.6 billion. Harvard asserted it is fully committed to its ability to host international students who, quote, enrich the university and the nation immeasurably. For TVP World, I'm Sonia Gatabishchan.
In a show of transatlantic unity, the G7 countries decided to keep Russian assets frozen and to impose new sanctions should the Kremlin fail to reach a ceasefire in Ukraine. However, things do not look as rosy between Washington and its European allies, as Trump has threatened the EU with a 50% trade tariff. And to talk about it and more, we're joined by Daniel Fried, former Assistant Secretary of State and former US Ambassador to Poland. Good evening, Mr. Ambassador.
Evening.
So what do you make of the G7 decision to heap sanctions on Russia if it continues to delay the peace process?
The G7 statement hopefully will trigger, hopefully heralds action to come. The G7 finance ministers said that it is possible to increase sanctions on Russia if there's not progress in a diplomatic solution to end the war. I think that we ought to be imposing additional sanctions right now. But at least the US signed up to this statement. But it is clear that Putin is, as the saying goes, jerking us all around. He is trying to manipulate the process and stall for time while the Russians keep hitting Ukraine. President Trump was right to push for a ceasefire, but President Trump inexplicably has backed away from his own good idea and undercut his European allies, the Poles, the Germans, the French, the British especially, who traveled to Kiev and made that call for an immediate ceasefire. So the G7 statement is a sign that maybe the U.S. is returning to pressure, but I would like to see far more than just a G7 statement. I would like to see action. I would like to see the sanctions imposed, including by the U.S., because we have sanctions options which would put pressure on Russia. Its economy isn't in that good shape, and we should not be leaving perfectly good leverage on the table.
Now, Russian assets remain frozen. We know that. But does this mean they will never help Kiev?
Well, the Biden administration's Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, Wally Adeyemo, wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs, came out earlier this week, in which he says, yeah, we ought to use the frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine. Well, he's right, and about time. We're sitting on nearly $300 billion of perfectly good Russian assets. Now, some of those assets are being used to fund about $50 billion worth of credits to Ukraine, and that's a good use. But I think we could use the rest of it right now to start funding arms flows to Ukraine, even if they're coming from Europe and not the United States, or paying for arms from the United States. That kind of a move, plus additional financial pressure on Russia, could convince Putin that his calculation, the time is on his side and he should continue the war, may not be the best course of action. We need to shake him up so that he agrees to end the war on reasonable terms.
Mr. Ambassador, I have a quote now. We're allowing Putin to lead Trump by the nose, and hopefully he'll get tired of this and push back. Do you know who said these words?
It's a good quote.
It was you, a month ago. Now, do you still hope Trump will get tired with Putin after their last phone call?
I'm less confident than I was a month ago, because Trump has gone sideways. He got very close to pushing sanctions through and making good on his previous threats. Then he backed away. He has agreed to negotiations that the Russians can string out for as long as they want. I think that it would be far better policy for the U.S. to align itself with the Polish, German, French, UK position, with the EU position, and push additional sanctions and announce that we're going to continue arms flows to Ukraine, financing to be determined. That might convince Putin that his calculation on Western weakness is not going to work. But we're not there yet. We are not there, and that is a problem.
Right. Now, Donald Trump has backed up from the sanctions, as you have already mentioned, that he has agreed with European leaders. Now he's threatening Europe with a 50% trade tariff. Now, how would you characterize what's going on between Washington and European capitals?
I think that Trump uses the threat of tariffs as a negotiating tool. He turns over the table and tries to look for a better deal. But Trump, since his April 2nd initial announcement of additional sanctions, has gone back and forth on sanctions so much that the shock power of these kinds of threats is beginning to weaken. The Europeans may just wait for Trump to back off. They may discuss countermeasures if Trump imposes those sanctions. And when the markets in the U.S., the stock market and the bond market start to weaken, move in the wrong direction, Trump may back off. This is not terribly effective. Trump calls himself a master negotiator, talks about doing deals. but in fact, by threatening and then backing away from his threats, the US is leaking away its credibility. And we have the power to hurt the European economy, but it will also hurt us.
Now, talking about negotiations, is Donald Trump ceding peace negotiations on the Vatican?
It's not a terrible idea to have the Vatican host negotiations if the Russians are willing. I doubt they will be willing. I think the Kremlin will try to stall and set conditions. They will play games because that's what they're going to do until they feel the heat. We have to put the heat on Russia. And until we do, Putin is not going to negotiate in good faith or seriously. And Poles need no American to explain this. The Poles' judgment on Russia has been consistently good for quite some time. We need to put the heat on the Russians, and then they can negotiate seriously. But they're not going to do anything seriously while Trump is enticing them with promises of economic cooperation or hints of new deals that bring Russia back into the G8. This is not going to work. We need to couple any offers we make to the Russians with genuine pressure, and we have options for additional pressure on the Russian economy.
All right. We also know that Donald Trump wants to meet with Vladimir Putin in person. Now, what can such a summit lead to? Well, according to American media, according to The Atlantic, Ukraine would not be a subject of a discussion during such a meeting.
For Trump to meet with Putin and not push a settlement in Ukraine would give Putin the win. There is no good reason on God's green earth that Trump should hold such any meeting with Putin for any reason except to push Putin to settle the Ukraine war. Otherwise, we are simply ceding Europe's security to the Russians and basically telling Putin that he can increase the pressure on Europe and that the United States will not do very much. It is not peace through strength, it's capitulation and weakness. Now, I'm not saying Trump is going to do that, but to meet with Putin without pushing on Ukraine would be a terrible mistake. It's the kind of blunder that Republicans used to make a meal of. But unfortunately, they have, under the Trump administration, there is some part of it which seems to be almost a parody of weak American diplomacy. Now, to be fair, there are many in the Trump administration and many in Trump world who favor a tough position on the Russians, and Trump's push for peace based on the current ceasefire and security for Ukraine could still work, in which case Trump would be able to claim with justice that he ended the war when Biden couldn't. But to get to that point, he needs to squeeze Putin, and so far he's been unwilling to do so.
So far he has squeezed someone else. And I have a question from the Ukrainian perspective. What becomes of the minerals deal if Russia continues its aggression?
Well, the minerals deal is a little bit vague, but it basically shows Trump in language he can understand that the U.S. has a stake in Ukraine. So taken as a whole, it's probably a good thing. But to get anything out of that minerals deal, yes, you're right, there has to be an independent Ukraine. So if Trump uses that minerals deal as a basis to talk himself into helping Ukraine by squeezing Russia, fine, it's worth it. But right now, the signals from the U.S. administration are inconsistent. There's some solid people in the administration trying to do the right thing, but Trump keeps undercutting them. And I do not understand why. There's no good reason that I can see.
Daniel Fried, former Assistant Secretary of State and former U.S. Ambassador to Poland, was our guest tonight. Thank you very much, Ambassador. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for watching and stay with us for much more news and features here on TVP World.